What prompted the Government Accountability Office, GAO, to develop and issue an AI accountability framework? And what are the core principles that set the foundation of this framework? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Taka Ariga, Chief Data Scientist and Director of the Innovation Lab at GAO, and Steve Sanford, Managing Director, Strategic Planning and External Liaison at GAO. So Taka, Steve, AI is a transformative technology holding substantial promise for improving government operations. For our purposes, I was hoping you could define for us, what is artificial intelligence and what are some of the key characteristics of AI? And perhaps you could highlight the three distinct waves of its development.
Yeah, great question. Part of our sort of ethos in creating this AI accountability framework is making sure that we don't get bogged down into sort of a definitional battle. And AI is one of those topics, right? So if you ask 10 data scientists how to define AI, you likely will get 50 different answers. So what we did in the framework is really point to the existing definition that are codified in the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, which sort of describes three, I think, broad general characteristics of AI. But more specifically, we want to align ourselves on the, from a evolution perspective, where is AI sitting today? This is where, as we were talking with DARPA as part of our initial exploratory conversation, I really sort of was, the way that they described different waves of AI really resonated well with me. So the first wave really is talking about an expert-based, expert-driven, rules-based approach to a lot of these solutions. So I think online tax preparation is a good example of that. In terms of a second wave, which is AIs of today, mostly machine learning driven, based heavily on statistical and mathematical techniques, but really are trying to achieve a very scope limited function, whether those are face recognition technology, whether those are some sort of loan adjudication programs, et cetera. In the third wave, which really is something that we are preparing ourselves for, are AI systems that are capable of basic reasoning and cognitive awareness. So for example, even the toddlers are really good at sort of trying to figure out, given sparsity of information, how might they address certain problems. Right now, AI is not really capable of that abstract reasoning, but there's a lot of research happening. So we want to make sure that we are able to account for some of the oversight challenges relative to not only the first wave, but the second wave of AI before increasing complexity, make an organization like GAO playing catch up as we start dealing with a third wave of AI. So for us, sort of characterizing AI in those sort of evolutionary terms was much more beneficial than trying to figure out whose definition of AI better fits our purpose.
You point out in the framework that federal guidance has focused on ensuring AI is responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable, and that third-party assessments and audits are important to achieving these goals. However, AI systems pose unique challenges to those oversights, to that kind of an oversight. I was hoping you'd spend a little time telling us about those challenges.
Yeah, happy to. And funny enough, the sort of guiding North Star for GAO's work oftentimes is based on generally accepted government auditing standards. And we have very similar type of sort of construct that government programs must be effective, efficient, equitable, economical, and ethical. So I think there's an established precedent in terms of how we can view technology such as AI. But in terms of specific challenges, let me just start with perhaps an easier aspects of how we might address those challenges, certainly around compliance. Are you sort of violating, for example, 1964 Civil Rights Act? There are certainly concerns around privacy. Are you collecting information for the purpose in which you're trying to use those information and no more than that? And then there are really well-publicized potentials for disparate impacts. Are you, promulgating stereotypes, or are you disadvantaging certain type of social demographic class? So those, I think, are fairly self-evident challenges when it comes to AI. But those focus more on the deployment and development side of the conversation. Part of the reason we developed the accountability framework is making sure an oversight entity such as GAO we also have the capacity and the methodology to evaluate AI. So for example, when we talk about data and models, do we need to actually collect those artifacts? And if we collect those artifacts, how might we review them, evaluate them in sort of a very computational and empirical way? So it really talks to not only challenges across the development and deployment of AI, but certainly from an oversight perspective, the kind of capacity and methodological issue that may also need to be addressed on case-by-case basis. And that's one of the reasons we laid out many of the audit procedure in the framework as well.
And what's interesting, Michael, building off what Taka said, Taka mentioned the Yellow Book, the GAGA standards. We also often will hang our hat at GAO on the internal control standards known as the Green Book, talking about how management needs to define and design and implement an effective control system. But a lot of these types of activities are based on the assumption that you can easily see what it is you're trying to control, or create internal controls for, or what you are auditing against. And one of the real challenges we find with artificial intelligence is that so much of how it works is often behind a kind of algorithmic wall, right? It's not something that can easily be audited in the traditional sense of it's there and it's visible. So it's that kind of black box nature of AI that often can present many challenges for the oversight community, and that was one of the motivations for doing the work here.
What more can you tell me about what prompted the reason to create this framework?
Great question. To Steve's point, in 2018, Steve and his team sort of identified AI as a transformative technology. And we're certainly starting to see that manifesting across various corners of the federal government. But when we sort of scan the horizon, there are a lot of high-level principles that are being developed, which I think is a great focus for data science. I think it's one of those rare moments where ethical concerns are being asked to co-evolve with advancing technology as well. I think that's great. But most of these principles are at a very high level. The way that I sort of describe them, they're almost equating to thou shalt do no harm, which is a very laudable goal. But what does that mean relative to the day-to-day work of data scientists, program managers, and then senior leadership? So we saw a gap in that conversation. And really what we wanted to do is take an attempt and really pushing those high-level principles down to key practices, key questions, and audit procedures at a level that are common across most AI lifecycle development. I think there are more work that needs to be done, but our goal is really to, since we're seeing some gaps in terms of the sort of evidence-driven verification approach to AI performance, and GAO certainly is in the business of trust but verify. We thought this is a really a needed framework that GAO is very well suited to develop. And frankly, from our perspective, the time for us to deal with AI accountability is not necessarily when we receive a congressional request, right? We want to make sure that we are proactively thinking about the oversight challenges of capabilities such as AI, and then develop a framework such as this so that when we're actually asked to do those assessments, there is a blueprint that we can follow.
And it's also important as these systems are in the wild right now. They are being deployed, more are being developed. And as that happens, as Taka said, it's inevitable that auditors, whether it's IGs within the agencies, whether it's state and local auditors looking at systems at that level, or it's GAO looking at federal systems, auditors are going to be asked to evaluate and look at how these systems performed. And we needed to be ahead of that curve. The other thing too is as agencies and other entities are building out these systems, it's useful for them to know what kinds of questions auditors are going to be asking about these systems. And that is in the framework. So it's a great beacon for the folks specifying, building, and running these systems to understand the types of questions that the accountability community is going to be bringing to the table when looking at the systems.
Yeah, and I'll just add, while the primary audience for this framework is certainly the federal agencies, but we realize agencies do partner with industry providers when it comes to services, when it comes to AI-related products. So this is also aimed at the broader ecosystem of AI developers, provider, product owner, to understand this is the kind of questions, to Steve's point, that an agency such as GAO will be asking. So it's almost like an open book test to say, our auditors will be following this framework. It will be, I think, a good idea in our sort of estimation that not only the federal government themselves, but also support contractor and sort of other industry providers are following a similar framework.
I was wondering, as a follow-up, can you tell us how GAO went about developing the framework? Who from the outside participated in the development, and did any federal agencies contribute to the development of this framework?
The short answer is yes. We consider AI as a team sport. It's not just the responsibility of data scientists, certainly not just the responsibility of program managers. So when we started developing this framework, our approach was to convene an expert panel. And we want to make sure that there were diverse representation on this expert panel, not only from an entity perspective. We certainly have federal agency, we have state local partners, we certainly have oversight organization joining us. We had academic institution, we have advocacy group, as well as nonprofit organization, but also industry partners as well. So certainly the perspective being represented were diverse. But secondarily, we want to make sure that as we are convening this expert panel, we have diversity across gender and other social attributes, so that when we're talking about disparate impact, the conversation is not abstract. So just to throw out a couple of data points here, when we convened the expert panel, 60% of the panelists were women, almost 40% of the panelists were minority. We had a number of research academic institutions represented. So I think this is an important part of the conversation in terms of this wasn't just developed in vacuum or in some sort of echo chamber. We really want to make sure that what we are advocating here is consistent with the current view, current best practices across the data science domain.
Yeah, Michael, I would just say, when the Comptroller General convened that expert forum back in September of 2020, and we brought together all those experts Taka mentioned from the federal government space, from industry, academia, nonprofits. We explicitly asked them, what do third-party assessors need to know and think about when they're going to look at AI systems? We were very upfront with the idea that we are trying to build an accountability model for AI. And I think there was great traction on that question because it was one that hadn't often been asked in the context of there's going to be auditors in the field doing this work and evaluating these systems. What tools do we have to give them? What practices, what questions do they have to be armed with in order to do that work? And so that was a pretty powerful way to get input on this project.
I was wondering if you folks could identify the 4 core principles that set the foundation for the AI accountability framework. And how did you come up with these principles? And more importantly, how do they complement one another?
Sure. With a lot of thoughts behind it. One of the challenges that we encounter as a sort of a byproduct of the expert panel itself was that discussion was so wide-ranging. How do we actually organize the input from close to 30 different experts talking about various perspectives? And how do we sort of organize that in a way that is logical and that can actually turn into a set of actionable practices for federal agencies and others to apply? So when we sort of start thinking about how do we distill the information, one of the very logical 2 principles that we initially arrived at is certainly the notion around data and performance. Many of our current day sort of AI solutions are driven by machine learning. So those have a lot of nexus around the quality of the data, reliability of the data, and that will immediately impact the kind of performance, not only on the technical level, but certainly on the sort of societal disparate impact type of conversation as well. So I think that was relatively straightforward. But even within data and performance, we want to make sure that we make a delineation between data being used to develop individual machine learning model versus data being used to operationalize AI systems, which often are ecosystems of those machine learning models. Similarly, for performance, we want to make sure that individual components of an AI solution is evaluated consistent with performance at this overall ecosystem level. And in many instances, and, some of those could be systems themselves in terms of driving complex implementation. And so as a bookend to both data and performance, we want to make sure that there a level of verifiable set of governance practices in place. So those are in terms of not only the requirements that are being codified on why the AI solution was being developed, but also talks about roles and responsibilities. Are there a diverse perspective, for example, whether legal input or input from civil liberty advocates in terms of addressing potential risks around disparate impacts, and whether those governance are being implemented not only at the system level, but whether those governance are sort of pushed out at the organization level to reflect the value of the organization. Especially in the public sector, I think those values are codified in many of the items that we already talked about. That federal government should be effective, efficient, equitable, economical, and ethical. And then on the monitoring piece, making sure that there are not only continuous monitoring of the performance of the AI solutions, but at a macro level, really look at, are these AI systems still meeting the design parameters that they were designed for? And if they're being scaled, are they being scaled appropriately and not haphazardly to include, other aspects that may or may not sort of drive the drift of underlying models and data?
Yeah, I mean, this whole point about monitoring, it came up earlier when we talked about the life cycle, and it's clearly forming one of the major components of our principles. And I think this is something that really merits attention when we're talking about AI systems. One of the main benefits of AI, beside being able to tackle problems that are just hard for humans to do, either computationally or otherwise, is that it's bringing a level of automation to a problem as well. And with that always comes the temptation to set it and forget it. But really, with the types of impacts these systems can have, especially depending on what contexts they are deployed in, setting it and forgetting it is not going to be usually a good approach. And really felt that having some focus on that as one of the major principles was essential as we built this out.
That's a good point, Steve. And, it follows up to my next point, because I want to talk about your governance. GAO identified key practices for establishing governance structures and processes at, as I understand it, at the organizational and systems level. Would you highlight some of the core practices agencies can use to manage, operate, and oversee the implementation of AI systems? And perhaps you could share with us an example of an AI governance structure.
Sure, happy to. So let me maybe give a rundown of some example of the elements that we would consider should be a part of a comprehensive governance structure. Certainly, there are mission statements in which the AI system is trying to achieve. There are problem definition, scope, and methodology. We expect to see goals and objectives, whether there are specific milestone and performance measures that are being codified. But beyond that, certainly what kind of resources and investments are required to actually achieve those goals and objectives. Organizational roles, who is responsible for what and what authority are they being delegated to achieve those goals and objectives, and whether there are external factors that could either accelerate or preventing achievement of those goals and objectives. And then the last three I'll just highlight are ethical value. Is the workforce actually ready to not only scope in AI capabilities, but consume output from AI? And then whether there are risks inherent to development, deployment, and sustainment of AI system. Relative to an example, I think many organizations are now starting to appoint roles such as the ethics officer relative to the development of their AI and deployment of the AI solution. I think Jake is a good example of that. Something that we put in our practice is making sure that those ethics officers actually have the power delegated to them to ask those hard questions and be able to sort of impact the direction of the development so that they're not just there to provide, for example, optional input, but programmers and data scientists will do whatever they want to do anyway. So I think that is a good example from a sort of a governance perspective, in that, having an ethical perspective is very interesting and very important, but are those perspectives being sort of integrated in a way that carries the weight behind the vision of integrating ethics into our AI implementation?
And Michael, I wanted to underscore quickly three of those key practices at the organizational level when we're talking about governance, and I think these are areas that really need a lot of attention. Taka mentioned the workforce, and having a workforce in place as part of the governance system. You have to be able to recruit and develop and retain people who have the multidisciplinary skills needed for every part of that AI lifecycle we talked about, whether it's the design and development, whether it's deploying and managing the system, or whether it's at the back end on the monitoring. So the workforce component of governance really needs to be carefully considered. Related to that, we talked about it before, but stakeholders, having the right stakeholders at the table as part of that governance, again, through every piece of the AI lifecycle. And then finally, how this plays into risk management, right? The governance system needs to look at AI-specific risk management issues so that any risks associated with the AI system are appropriately identified, analyzed, and mitigated.
Well, Taka and Steve, you did a wonderful job of explaining the foundations of the AI accountability framework. I'd like to switch gears a bit and talk about, maybe highlight some of the factors to consider when auditing an AI system. Are there internal controls that can be applied to managing and operating AI systems?
There certainly are. One of the key nuances of AI is that a lot of the outputs coming out of AI is probabilistic, as opposed to binary. Very, rarely would you come across an AI system that essentially generate a yes or no, black and white type of answers. A lot of time is depending on, more likely than not, what might be, a cat might be a cat or a cat might be a panda. So from an internal control perspective, we certainly adapted many sort of principles from our Green Book to talk about areas of reasonableness, areas of completeness. So it's not necessarily trying to be prescriptive to say your governance structure must include X number of points, X number of paragraph per se, but we're really looking to apply that sort of professional judgment to say, have you codified your requirements with sufficient level of detail that either a technical subject matter expert or a lay person can interpret consistently. So those are some of the key factors to consider when it comes to auditing AI system. I think documentation is paramount. So whether that's a model card, whether that's data card, or some other policy documents or technical evaluation documents, I think from a control perspective, we just want to make sure that not only the rationale but the key results are documented continually, so that those control can be evaluated by a third party, but also compare and contrast across the continuous monitoring cycle as well.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with Taka Ariga, Chief Data Scientist and Director of the Innovation Lab at GAO, and Steve Sanford, Managing Director, Strategic Planning and External Liaison at GAO. Subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.